It is a beautiful day back here in my hometown of Portland, Maine. Spring is definitely sprung. It's been a great day to be outside and taking some time now to do the meditation. This is from this date 10 years ago, and it's Being and Learning pages 93 and 94, and it's the 59th poetic meditation, phenomenological meditation. So we're getting up there. Tomorrow is going to be number 60, and out of 360 plus. So still a long way to go in this epic journey, as my colleague Tyson Lewis, who appeared in one of this blog's videos, called it. It's like a philosophical epic. So still in chapter 4, which is called Plato's Allegory of the Cave. A slow reading and rereading and rewriting of Plato's allegory. And with this last couple of days, I've been thinking about the truth of concealment, right? So in what way is the cave dwelling something that is a kind of preparation or a renewal, if you will, the place where we are sort of rooted, in our being. And in this sense, I've been talking about it as like education, right? So yesterday was the first day that I really talked about education as opposed to learning, and education being something like the directed holding back of our enactment of freedom. And so turning to Arendt's Crisis in Education. So let's pick it up. There are a number of distinct ways to identify the appearance of the truth of concealment throughout the entire allegory, for it represents the originary side of the twofold play that is at the center of the processual unfolding, which manifests through and moves in the turnings and passages or movements from one stage to another. The entire story exemplifies the twofold play, and thus the truth of concealment is present throughout. However, as a dynamic phenomenon, the twofold play appears in a plurality of ways, and so in the first part of the allegory, we identify it as appearing as the basis of the preparation for the truth of appearance, the shining forth of the essential relation between beings and being, which unfolds in the releasement into the open region, the freedom of learning. How does the twofold play, and specifically the truth of concealment, appear in the first part of the story? The truth of concealment, as the hiding of appearance, most essentially manifests in part 1 of the story, for it is the essence of the theater of illusion, schooling to conceal. This means that each of the elements within the cave reveals in a unique manner the truth of concealment in its originary form. The first part of the story is first in the sense of initiating the tale of education as a myth of preparation, initiation, and departure. That myth that appears and reappears to each and every one of us in our life's journey, our purposeful wandering with others. Together, the shadows, the chains, the puppets, and most importantly, the puppeteers or performers are all revealing the truth of concealment and thereby playing a part in the preparation of the apprentice. We focus first and foremost on the performers who have designed and maintained this ongoing theater of illusion. Who are these performers, and who do they represent for us within the context of our exploration of being and learning? To begin, we might consider who Plato might have had in mind when he imagined these characters. Arendt offers us a hint that Plato probably was thinking of that group of wandering teachers who had become popular, if not notorious, specifically in the circle Plato moved in, for the teaching of rhetoric, or the art of persuasive speech. Sophist is the name we have received for these wandering teachers of rhetoric. Rhetoric, an extremely valuable art within a world that prided itself on its capacity to conduct its affairs through communication, and especially to handle conflict through persuasive argumentation rather than physical violence, which is a necessary last resort. If communication finds its limits, as it inevitably does, these limits manifest most readily in the natural tensions arising from distinct communicative styles. As wandering teachers, the Sophists had certainly developed a keen sense of the plurality of communicative performances, an acute capacity to hear the nuances between the varied dialects and local forms they encountered in their travels throughout Peloponnesia. Over time, as these teachers formed into a recognized school of teachers, their sensitivity to local sounds, to the polyphonic range of speaking, defined the Sophist approach to rhetoric as the art of style over substance. Thus, our received understanding of rhetoric, that places this art in stark contrast to philosophy, which is hardly considered an art, and certainly not one identified with placing the highest value on developing an acute awareness of and capacity to hear difference. Our received view of philosophy, in fact, can be traced back to Plato's revision of Socrates' life's work as an ongoing confrontation with the Sophists, these teachers who wandered into town with their foreign accents and somehow were able to compete with the locals for the most eager students. The overwhelming majority of Plato's dialogues center around this conflict he perceived between Socrates and the Sophists, between style versus substance, between art and what we would today call science. Plato's deep suspicion and even distrust of the Sophists motivated him to produce many of his most celebrated dialogues with titles bearing the names of the most prominent members of the school: Gorgias, Protagoras, and of course Sophists, which, as Arendt reminds us, formed the first part of a never-completed trilogy, Sophist-Statesman-Philosopher. We might conjecture that the last and never-completed dialogue, Philosopher, was simply the sum total of his depiction of his teacher Socrates. And if we follow Arendt, we arrive back to the cave, where we find the proper abode of rhetoric as opposed to thinking, for Plato the originary location of concealment. Quote, "As for thinking, the question of where we are when we think seems to have been raised only by Plato in the Sophist. There, after having determined the Sophist's locality, he promised to determine the philosopher's proper locality as well, the topos noetos he had mentioned in the earlier dialogues, but he never kept his promise. It may have been that he simply failed to complete the trilogy Sophist-Statesman-Philosopher, or that he had come to believe that the answer was implicitly given in the Sophists, where he pictures the Sophist as, quote, at home in the darkness of not being, which, quote, makes him so hard to perceive, and, quote, whereas the philosopher is difficult to see because his region is so bright, for the eye of the many cannot endure to keep its gaze fixed on the divine." It's in the Sophist 254a through b. That answer could indeed be expected from the author of the Republic and the Cave Parable. Arendt is particularly insightful here, but we might want to take our analysis a step or two further and consider how, within the context of the allegory, this conflict between sophist and philosopher could be resolved, or better, the contradiction held together as the moments of the twofold play. For if the main actors in the theater of illusion are meant to represent the sophist, then it is also from this group that we identify the one responsible for initially releasing the bonds and calling out to the prisoner. But we jump ahead in our exploration. First, we must take a moment to consider how a wandering band of rhetoricians might best exemplify those leading actors who prepare and ultimately release the apprentice. That's it. I'm going to go back and reread that quotation from Arendt a little bit slower. Now this again is talking about, and I'm trying to make the link between the Sophists as described by Plato, the place where they dwell, as Arendt describes it in, this is from her work Life of the Mind, the section where she says, where she asks the question, where are we when we are thinking? And I'm trying to make the connection here between the Sophist and the allegory of the cave. So this is from Arendt. As for thinking, the question of where we are when we think seems to have been raised only by Plato in this Sophist. There, after having determined the sophist's locality, he promised to determine the philosopher's proper locality as well. The topos, noetos, he had mentioned in the earlier dialogues, but he never kept his promise. It may have been that he simply failed to complete the trilogy of the Sophist-Statesman-Philosopher, or that he had come to believe that the answer was implicitly given in the Sophist, where he pictures the Sophist as, quote, at home in the darkness of not being, quote, which makes him so hard to perceive. So this is the real point here of this meditation. It's to use this quotation from Arendt. Again, no notes, so this is all full disclosure. So confessing that I don't recall if at this point I had read this quotation, because it's not unlikely that I had read this quotation in the Life of the Mind and was leading up to it. I don't recall this, but knowing myself, I could see very possibly that I had read this quotation and said, let me write, this quotation tells me that we may think of the sophist as, for Plato anyway, those who are the ones who are organizing this quote-unquote theater of illusion. But because we have no other information, we have to suppose that it's possible that one of them is responsible for liberating the cave dweller. Well, if that's the case, then they serve an important role. The sophist and the learning of the art of rhetoric serves an important role. Now, it's a stretch, because to say this is to break with what Plato has said in the Republic when it comes to the education of rhetorical education. So if his position is that what the Republic is ultimately about is the education of the philosopher, who's then capable of being part of a class of people that are going to run the affairs of the polis, political affairs of the polis, be the lawgivers and the ones who maintain the system of justice. If that's the case, then it's not clear that rhetoric would be an art that they would be that they should know. So, but at any rate, there's a purpose in the art of rhetoric, right? There's the capacity to say, and what I'm trying to suggest, and of course I'm not, my interest is in no way to be faithful to Plato. So what I'm saying is that if it's the case that the sophist had this capacity of being sort of really attentive to language, if their skill was that they were adept at the nuances of languages, if that they could pick up styles and ways of speaking, and if their great strength was that they were gifted at the art of rhetoric, of speaking, and could teach others to do that, then this is obviously not something that we should be dismissing out of hand, and in fact it's obviously something that we should be considering as important to the endeavor. Because in the end, it's the case that if one way that we are making philosophy, and it's been traditionally the most prominent way that we're making philosophy, is through writing and speaking, then we should be talented, right, in the multiple ways in which we can write and speak. And this is part of the project that I've been developing in the last couple of years, that being and learning is one example of, which is called originary thinking. Right? So the notion that I'm doing poetic phenomenological meditations is important to me, because it suggests that language can't be confined to a particular form in the way that we use it. The fact that philosophy is most often associated with a logical argumentation, with so-called ordinary language, with the analysis of ordinary language and so forth, is a problem, because it's limiting precisely our capacity to render descriptions and to communicate ideas and to make meaning and so on and so forth. All the ways in which we do philosophy, it's limiting it, and it's saying, and it's limiting what philosophy can do. And if philosophy is this general category, and that's how I've been describing it now for the last month, if philosophy is a very general category for the way in which we enact our freedom, and only in the last couple of days have I been talking about this freedom being sort of pursued in a particular way, which is to say under the formula that Arendt has given us, which is renewal and repair of the world, and the world is that which sort of circular. The world is the thing that brings us together and quote-unquote sets us apart. That is, brings us together but also allows us to remain singular and unique. So we have to take care of the world, and we also have to, and taking care of the world means caring for it in the sense of repairing it and renewing it. Now, it would seem that if the ways that we do that is through multiple, through enacting our freedom, that's going to happen in many ways. So philosophy has to be a very wide category, and within that wide category there have to be many forms in which we're communicating it and making it. So if sophists are those who are preparing us to do that, if they are giving us the ability to see from multiple perspectives, if you will, and I think that's the whole point of the paideia that happens in the allegory of the cave. If a sophist sort of who is recognizing that there is a purpose to the art of rhetoric that isn't just about power. I mean, that's the big issue, and I don't want to go on too much about that, but the issue for Plato isn't so much about the different forms of language, but it's what are they being used for. And so the way that we've inherited the debate is that the sophists were using language in order to win others over, and that is to say in their argument, which is to say for political purposes. And so Foucault talks about power always being present and every relationship being one that is framed by power, and every relationship involves moves of power. Well, the sophists then represent the attempt to move others, and so we talk about it as the language of instrumental reasoning, where we're trying to get others to come over to our ideas, or to sort of think the way that we think, or think a particular idea, and or to do the things we want to do. So, being a salesperson, a politician, etc., etc. There are different forms, legal minds. They're all different forms of quote-unquote rhetoric in which we're trying to convince others to do the things that we want them to do. Now, that can be sort of a neutral point, because, if we're trying to move people to do the right thing, quote-unquote, we're using rhetoric, and that's my point. So, but the debate is that if it's purely about gaining power, and that seems to be what the real rub is for Plato, and a lot of the dialogues are about this. If the point is to get and gain power and gain status and to get power, as opposed to being in power, then for Plato there's an issue, there's a problem there, and I'd have to agree with that. That it's one thing to talk about a diversity of perspectives and being able to see from multiple perspectives and being able to move into different forms, but all that there's sort of like a purpose to our use of language and to our use of our freedom, if you want to put it in those terms. And if we're guided by an attempt to create a just world, which I think is what Arendt is saying without saying that, a world where others can be free, that is to say, we're a space where others can be heard and hear others and see others, then we're about empowerment, and we're about creating a space where people are empowered as opposed to gaining power and having power over others. And so sometimes I joke that I'm interested in power, and I am interested in power. I'm interested in power as the sort of fundamental concern of mine in terms of philosophy. But by saying that, I mean the feeling of empowerment, not about having power or having power over others. So I'll leave it at that for today, the 12th day of April 2014, commemorating the writing that happened 10 years ago today.